Mission was to bomb Tokyo and other key military target cities. The goal was to deal a psychological blow to the enemy in retribution for Japan's Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier that had propelled America into World War II.
We did not know what our mission was outside of that. We knew we were going to take off of a carrier. What the destination was, and 2 days at sea, they told us over the PA system what our target was.
The mission was top secret. Even Chinese nationalists and their Flying Tigers Air Force in Japanese-occupied China did not know about it.
Initially, being the first airplanes, we were to be the pathfinder and take off at dusk on the 19th of April. And our job was to light up Tokyo for what damage we could do with our incendiary bombs, and also give the following airplanes some kind of a reference, since it was all open water navigation, so they could get a reference to their targets, because some of them was going on down to Nagoya and Kobe.
Even with additional fuel, the mission exceeded the B-25's operational range. The Doolittle Raiders had to ditch or crash land their planes in China. Some of them were captured by the Japanese and executed. Brooks field-trained Lieutenant Robert Metter, the former Miami University track star who co-piloted plane number 6, died from malnutrition in a Japanese prison camp. Prior to the Doolittle raid, another war hero who contributed to Brooks' history flew the hostile skies over China. Brigadier General David Lee Tex Hill had become a triple ace with the American volunteer group known as the Flying Tigers. Hill was part of a group of American volunteers under the command of General Claire Chennault. Chennault had built his controversial Army Air Corps career on advocating fighter-pursuit aircraft superiority over bombers. He had been recruited to serve in China by General Lissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese leader. The Chinese general knew he could not defeat the Japanese without an air force.
He knew he needed an instant air force. And the only way you get an instant air force would be to recruit professionals. The Chinese Air Force had been decimated. It's just a name only. So in order to keep China in the war, they needed an instant air force.
Chennault's Flying Tigers became China's instant air force. From early 1941 to July 1942, the Flying Tigers terrorized the Japanese in their distinctive P-51 Mustangs. American volunteer group pilots shot down 297 enemy planes while losing only 4 pilots in aerial combat. After the war, Tex Hill helped revive the Flying Tigers under the 14th Air Force. He also revived pilot training at Brooks Air Force Base by helping form the 8707th Pilot Training Wing in 1952 that became part of the 14th Air Force.
Brooks was just a kind of a surplus field out there, and it fit all of our needs because we had small aircraft that we could operate out of there. So they only had a short runway.
In 1954, Hill took over the newly renamed 433rd Troop Carrier Wing's pilot training program at Brooks Air Force Base. The unit became known throughout the United States as the Alamo Wing. Hill was determined to turn the 433rd into a reliable and operationally effective Air Reserve organization.
One thing would drive me up a wall, and that was a bad formation. If you see guys flying bad formation, you can figure it's a bad outfit. And I was a real bug on that, and a lot of times I'd have to go up and show them how to do it, how I wanted it done.
Under Hill's leadership, the 433rd became peacetime aviation heroes. The unit flew many humanitarian relief missions, to include food and medical supplies flown to hurricane victims south of the border. Humanitarian missions are only part of a larger story of Brooks' enduring contributions to military and civilian medicine. Air evacuation, later known as aeromedical evacuation, would be forever associated with the Brooks legacy. The foundation for this legacy was laid during World War II. In 1942, the Army Air Corps was given the responsibility for developing an air evacuation system. The Army Air Forces had adopted a wartime policy of using Air Transport Command's troop carrier and air transport planes for secondary air evacuation missions. Transporting critically ill and injured patients over long distances was seldom done prior to World War II. Technological advances in aircraft and air evacuation changed the dynamics of air transport patient care. Air evacuation technological innovation originated during the dawn of powered flight. As early as 1910, patients had been evacuated by aircraft. Between 1918 and 1930, 8 different aircraft were modified or specially designed to be air ambulances. These aircraft could carry up to 6 stretcher or ambulatory patients. No medical personnel accompanied patients on these early flights. However, air evacuation before World War II was limited by the War Department that saw no need for air ambulances. Nevertheless, during 1918, events conspired to force the development of air ambulances. The rapid wartime expansion of pilot training led to the establishment of numerous training fields in areas with poor roads. It often took several hours before pilots, injured in a crash, could be transported to a hospital, if they could have been reached by a ground ambulance at all. In the early months of expanded pilot training at Army Air Service bases, such as Brooks Field, flight surgeons began to maintain crash response aircraft. These aircraft allowed doctors to provide emergency care at crash sites prior to the arrival of a ground ambulance. However, no aircraft of the era was capable of transporting injured pilots to the hospital. Captain William Ocker, who pioneered blind flying at Brooks Field a decade later, envisioned in 1918 the practical use of air evacuation. At Gertzner Field, Louisiana, Ocker discerned the need for an air ambulance capable of carrying injured pilots to the base hospital. Ocker and Dr. Nelson Driver converted a Jenny airplane into an air ambulance that carried Army litters. On July 23, 1918, all Army airfields were directed to convert an air service aircraft into an air ambulance. However, during World War I, planes were sparingly used for air evacuation missions. By World War II, air evacuation had become a necessity. During the war, nearly 3 million sick and wounded servicemen were air evacuated to the U.S. Air evacuation's wartime success and its subsequent contributions at Brooks Air Force Base in post-war America would not have been possible without the vision and actions of General David Grant. As Army Air Corps Air Surgeon, Grant conceived the idea of using military cargo planes to transport combat casualties. He created the Air Evacuation Service and manned it with medical professionals trained in air evacuation. Grant's initiative, however, would not have gotten off the ground had it not been for the pioneering work of Ohio native Loretta Schimler. Grant's air evacuation idea, which spawned the creation and development of Air Force flight nursing, is rooted to Schimler's vision and actions. In 1932, she formed the Aerial Nurse Corps of America. This organization consisted of physically qualified and technically trained nurses committed to improving and increasing air ambulance service in America. During the 1930s, few patients were transported by air due to the era's lack of trained aviation medical professionals and medical technological limitations. The Aerial Nurse Corps of America developed a reputation of service and reliability. While the organization had no official mandate or government affiliation, Schimler's group of dedicated professionals became an operationally effective medical care in the Air Force. They helped allay fears spawned by the pervasive perception in America that it was foolhardy, if not dangerous, to move sick and injured people in aircraft not sufficiently equipped to safely transport patients. General Grant was inspired by Schimler's Nurse Corps. He envisioned the need for wartime Army Air Corps flight nurses. His idea led to the creation in October of 1942 of the School of Air Evacuation at Bowman Field, Kentucky. The School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph and later Brooks Field was put in charge of air evacuation training. The Air Evacuation School taught Army nurses and former airline hostesses trained in nursing how to load, unload, and care for patients during air evacuation missions. The school also developed airplane litters, oxygen systems, and portable support equipment. In 1943, the first 39 flight nurses graduated from the school. None of them considered themselves heroines, but their wartime sacrifices that supported the survival of air-evacuated patients became legendary. Their heroic work was perpetuated at Brooks Air Force Base, the post-war venue for Air Force air evacuation and flight nurse training, as well as aeromedical technological innovation. From 1945 to 1959, Brooks Air Force Base was the center for Air Force air evacuation. The National Security Act of 1947 had by June 1948 established the Military Air Transport System. Commonly called MATS, it was responsible for all air evacuation missions. Brooks and Kelly Air Force bases were the nexus for air evacuation feeder routes. These routes channeled patients onto the MATS transcontinental system. MATS assigned pilots, while the School of Aviation Medicine provided the aircraft and medical professionals to staff air evacuation flights. The School of Aviation Medicine was also responsible for training flight surgeons, flight nurses, and air evacuation technicians, a mission that continues today. By 1949, air evacuation had become the U.S. Armed Forces' primary method of moving patients. Air evacuation subsequently played a vitally important role during the Cold War era. Air evacuation missions, managed by the 1st Aeromedical Transport Group headquartered at Brooks Air Force Base, supported the movement of Korean War casualties.
High praise must be paid to the elements engaged in evacuating by air of wounded personnel and of individuals behind enemy lines. Countless numbers of soldiers have been saved by prompt and efficient actions of the air rescue and evacuation units. The wounded UN soldier has a better chance of recovery than the soldier of any previous war. This was not only by virtue of improved medical treatment available at all echelons, but also in large measure because of his ready accessibility to major installations provided by rapid air evacuation. Major General Matthew Ridgway.
Rapid air evacuation was also the key to patient survival during another kind of war, the war against poliomyelitis. Also known as infantile paralysis, 20th century polio outbreaks afflicted more than 500,000 Americans. From 1952 to 1954, the height of the last major epidemic in the U.S., over 100,000 people contracted polio. Many thousands, including the most vulnerable, children, succumbed to the disease's deadly effects. Those who did not die were crippled for life. The most critically ill polio victims were kept alive in iron lungs, a large metal tank with pumps used to assist respiration. Philip Drinker and Louis Shaw had invented this device in 1928. However, many polio victims who lived far from iron lung treatment facilities did not survive the early acute stages of the disease because of air transport technological limitations. Iron lungs were too massive for practical use on an airplane. These giant respirators, first commercially produced in 1931, were not designed for treating polio victims aloft. Iron lungs required 110-volt alternating current to operate, unavailable on aircraft of the era. If not for the heroic actions of 2 Air Force innovators, countless polio victims would not have survived an epidemic that had become, by the mid-1950s, a pandemic. In 1952, Dr. Cyril Wilkes, a U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine physiologist, came up with a practical solution for transporting polio patients by air. Assisted by Captain Joseph Tomaszewski, Dr. Wilkes supervised the development of the world's first portable iron lung. Called the SAM lung, named after the School of Aviation Medicine where it was invented, the device became the first reliable full-body respirator capable of transporting critically ill polio patients by air evacuation aircraft. Its reliability was based on School of Aviation Medicine engineer Frank Garbick's innovative idea to power the SAM lung using 24-volt direct current from a Eureka vacuum cleaner motor.
Well, some of them were completely helpless, and of course those people were transported in the portable iron lung, and they weren't transported at all until the iron lung came along. But the others were people who were weakened by polio, and they just needed some assistance in breathing.
The Air Force initially built 2 SAM lungs. They were the only ones that existed on Earth. Brooks Air Force Base became a hub for what became known as Mercy Flights, air evacuating hundreds of polio patients in SAM lungs from around the globe. Besides the SAM lung, Air Force ingenuity also had been applied to safely transporting patients by air who have had cervical cord injuries. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Collins, who in 1963 was in charge of aeromedical research and development at the 1st Aeromedical Transport Group Surgeon's Office at Brooks Air Force Base, pioneered aeromedical evacuation technological development. His aeromedical evacuation innovations have been widely acclaimed as representing a milestone in the treatment of patients with cervical fracture dislocations. Collins's greatest invention is the surgical traction device that bears his name. The device has been used for treating and transporting patients with cervical spine fractures, dislocations, and back and neck injuries. Before this device was invented, aeromedical evacuation technicians had to hold weights attached to pulleys used for traction when flying in turbulent weather. Maintaining equal traction on patients during aeromedical evacuation flights was a serious problem. Collins's invention greatly reduced the chance of in-flight turbulence causing further injury and possibly paralysis to aeromedical evacuated patients. Several other Brooks Air Force Base innovations contributed to the development of aeromedical evacuation technology. In 1965, School of Aerospace Medicine engineer Henry Whitmore invented the revolutionary electronic stethoscope. This device allowed aeromedical evacuation professionals to hear patients' heartbeats over aircraft engine noise. By 1968, the jet-powered C-9 Nightingale began replacing propeller-driven air evacuation aircraft. The School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks contributed to the C-9's design that also leveraged other school-inspired innovations. These included new therapeutic oxygen systems for patients with respiratory problems and wider patient loading ramps. Brooks' air evacuation legacy is defined by the School of Aerospace Medicine's development of critical care air transport teams and expeditionary medical support. Nicknamed CCAT, critical care air transport teams have been instrumental in safely transporting combat casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan. Inaugurated in 1997, CCAT resulted from a shift in patient care strategies following the First Persian Gulf War. The aeromedical evacuation system had to respond to a new dynamic, transporting less stable patients who had been in the operational theater a much shorter time than in America's previous overseas deployments. Prior to CCAT, the air evacuation community did not have a reliable capability of moving extremely critical, near-death patients. CCAT's capability was augmented in 1999 when the School of Aerospace Medicine developed at Brooks expeditionary medical support training. Called EMEDS, this revolutionary rapid response medical care system has been used during wartime contingency operations and humanitarian relief missions. CCAT and EMEDS trained military personnel have expanded the concept of heroism through their actions to save lives throughout the world. To hurricane, earthquake, and tsunami victims, these specialized Air Force aeromedical evacuation personnel, trained at Brooks, are true American heroes.